Welcome to Quiet Before. My name is Melissa Ho, and I'm so happy today to be in conversation with Trisha Lagaso Goldberg and Mark Johnson. And we're here to talk about the exhibition Carlos Villa, Worlds in Collision, which was co-curated by the two of you. Trisha and Mark are highly accomplished independent curators, scholars, and artists. Both also knew and worked with Carlos Villa. This exhibition was organized by the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco and the San Francisco Art Institute, and it opened at the Newark Art Museum in February 2022, before then having a homecoming presentation in San Francisco, opened there in June 2022, and I think closed in November 2022, and we're speaking now in May 2023. And just a huge privilege to have a conversation about the making of the show, probably also reflections that you have on your experience of bringing it to these different audiences. This exhibition was so highly anticipated. For someone like me coming from outside the Bay Area, I really had only gotten glimpses of Carlos Villa's work here and there over the years. And so it was thrilling when I heard that there was going to be this major museum show, a major illustrated catalog, and you truly delivered. It was a glorious presentation, a full-scale presentation across all media, different phases of his career. And it had great impact. And I think especially having that show presented at Newark to audiences who were not nearly as aware of Villa's career as people in California, it was truly revelatory. And then lastly, I want to call out the fact such a landmark, not only in being the largest museum presentation of Carlos Villa's work, but the first museum retrospective dedicated to any Filipino-American artist, which is sort of shocking. That leads into my first question. Could you talk about the genesis of the show and also your thoughts on why did the show happen when it did?
Melissa, it's such an honor to be in conversation with you in the middle of transforming the Smithsonian American Art Museum to being a museum that features Asian American perspectives. This is Carlos's dream to diversify our environment, our art history, our story. I know he would have loved talking with you as well. Trisha and I have just spoken about the fact that this is something that's been in the works for a long time. We both knew and worked with him, but I'll just tell one story to start us off. We were both personal friends as well as colleagues who collaborated on various projects. And in the course of that, Carlos moved into a studio building that I became a part of in 1981, so many years ago. He moved in 1994. Carlos was famous for throwing away bodies of work because storage for all artists is difficult, and the Bay Area has a rich history of that. And we knew some work that was around, but after his passing, there was a situation where we needed to do some electrical work in a crawl space. And because the crawl space was over the space that I use, it was my responsibility. And when I found someone to help me go into the crawl space and we turned on the lights, there were all these rolls, some in plastic, but not everything in plastic, covered with tar because the roof had been repaired a few years ago. It suddenly dawned on me that we might be looking at a really important collection, and we pulled out the first roll. And the very first piece that we unrolled was a piece called Ritual from 1971, which is an incredible masterpiece of Carlos Villa's, and we later pulled out about 50 works. They were filthy and they needed to be cleaned. And because of Carlos's long history with the San Francisco Art Institute, a colleague named Catherine Reasoner suggested that we approach the Art Institute's graduate studios that had a lot of wall space just as a place to unroll, assess, measure, get a complete inventory of what was there. It turned into a mini exhibition. First was just going to be for a weekend, and then it turned into a longer period, and finally it was up for a summer. And during the course of the little reception that we hosted, the then president of the Art Institute, Gordon Knox, came up and said, why don't we conceptualize an exhibition to celebrate the 150th founding of the San Francisco Art Institute? The school was founded in 1871, the oldest art school in the West. And so 2021 would be the 150th anniversary. And that was the official launch for this project.
Can you talk more about that incredible discovery in the studio?
What's interesting for me is that several of those pieces that were found in the studio have found their way into museum collections already. I'll just mention one. The Asian Art Museum acquired a piece called First Impressions. It was a piece that Carlos made by covering his face with a chalky paint and then wiping it. And he did it 60 times. And then he arranged the 60 facial impressions in a grid on a very large canvas and attached some bone dolls. And I remember Carlos saying when he looked at that piece, he didn't see his own face, he saw his mother's. And it's one of many examples where Carlos used his own body indexically, that's the word we're using, to basically foreground a Filipino-American visage, a Filipino-American body, a Filipino-American cultural identity.
And Trisha, were you involved yet at that stage? Were you around to see these paintings come out for the first time in years?
So I was living in Hawaii. I did 2 degrees and got married and had a kid in the Bay Area. So this is definitely my second home, but I was born and raised in Hawaii. And in 2005, I moved back there to, my husband and I did, to raise our kid. And somewhere in there, I actually, this is before Carlos passed away in 2013. Carlos reached out to me and asked if we could work on an exhibition together, a solo exhibition of his work for the Honolulu Museum of Art. So I was actually developing an exhibition with him and presented it, to the museum. And it never came to fruition, but an exhibition of Carlos's work was never far from either Mark or my minds, even before his departure from this plane. This is something that I was already kind of working with him on and thinking about how to position Carlos within a larger context and storyline of Asian American and Filipino American immigration and art history. That's to say, it predates the encounter that Mark, pulling out these paintings from the storage space at the studio there. And so I was still living in Hawaii at the time, and it just happened to coincide, Mark's talking about presenting these works at the Art Institute, and Margo Machida, premier Asian American scholar, writer, curator, happened to be in the Bay at the same time as me and my family. So we all went to go and see the works together at the Art Institute at the pier. So I have a photo at Fort Mason after witnessing these works, which I had never seen before. I was familiar with some of Carlos's early works. I met him in the late 90s when he was working on the kind of Manung Door oeuvre, like that body of work with the black feathers, and it was sort of monochromatic, and he was sort of going through his own family archive. But these paintings were from the 80s or even before, and it was a palette that I wasn't familiar with. Bright and really vibrant reds and yellows and pinks and blues. Carlos often made this jump from the visual to music really quickly in his work, and music played a really central role in his own life and the way that he engaged with his work. And these notes of color I had never heard before in his practice. So it was super exciting for me to see this part of Carlos's composition of the kind of music that he played, the kind of, the vibe that he was, expressing and tapping into in his own life, all together, consolidated. And it felt like such a gift. It wasn't long after this moment, I think it was 2017, when I saw these works with Mark and Margo. I moved back to the Bay Area in 2018. And then shortly after that, Mark, invited me to become co-thought partners around an exhibition. And that's when Mark and I started together to think about what an exhibition of this scale and scope might look like.
Was this the first project that the two of you co-curated together?
No.
We've known each other since the 90s. I met Mark and Carlos together on campus at San Francisco State University. Mark was just hired as the gallery director at San Francisco State, and Carlos was on board. Keith Morrison was the dean at the time and had brought Carlos in to work with students and to kind of cook up some projects. And I met them both at the same time. And I mean, it really was my introduction to working in a gallery space with Mark and Carlos. That, in addition to work that I ended up doing at Southern Exposure.
When we talk about Carlos, there's also this wonderful community of people that are a part of it. Keith is a central person who, although Carlos was a longtime faculty, more than 40 years teaching at the Art Institute, Keith invited him to come to San San Francisco State and be an artist in residence. Carlos wanted to develop an exhibition, and I was the gallery director at that time. Trisha was the co-curator for a wonderful exhibition that traveled to Manila. And we believe it is the first ever exhibition of Filipina American artists. So, kind of another first.
Carlos was this kind of, he had this way of bringing people together. And before you knew it, you were working on some kind of epic international, first of its kind project. He just had this ultimate faith that things would work out and that you'd find the kind of support that he absolutely gave of himself as part of this support structure. But one of his superpowers was networking others, and creating community. So through the, Mark is referring to the San Francisco Babaylan Sisters City Sisters exhibition, which traveled from San Francisco to Manila with the then Mayor Willie Brown's Culture and Trade Mission. And it included, artists, including Jennifer Wofford and the Mail Order Brides, Rihanna Estrada, Eliza Barrios, Johanna Potig, Terry Acebo Davis, Catherine Wagner, Lucille Tanazis. I mean, it was an incredible experience. And many of these artists were 20 years my senior, and it was my first gig. So yeah, it was a steep learning curve, but one that I, ran into willingly and eagerly to learn. I was so eager to learn. And it's really thanks to Carlos.
To return to the question of the form that this exhibition actually ended up taking, was there a conversation with Carlos before his passing of organizing something of this scale as a retrospective?
I talked to Carlos about 1 million projects, and we did 1,000,001, but we did not talk about a retrospective. Just to be really clear, Carlos was born in 1936. So he's almost a whole generation older than me, and then I'm a generation older than Trisha. So we've got multiple generations kind of at work, and Carlos created this environment of mentorship where it felt like it was, besides being multicultural, it was multi-generational. Carlos was this public intellectual who generated all these ideas. He was somebody who would call you up at very early in the morning. I think all of our partners learned to be disturbed by the phone when it would ring at 6:30 in the morning, old school telephone, because it would always be Carlos, and he's so excited to share whatever he had dreamed up literally the night before. Most of those things were about this diverse vision of America. What makes a great artist? I think it's that you work at it every day, and Carlos worked on his artwork every day, and he was happy to have exhibitions to showcase his work, but he made a very conscious kind of move away from commercial galleries fairly early in his career. Although he was making work, he decided to show at alternative spaces primarily, so that he could also put a lot of his organizational energy and vision into creating these symposia and public conversations that use the arts to focus on how we can make American culture more representative of the American public.
When I met him and Mark, what I really appreciated and connected with was his dedication to other teachers. I come from a family of educators, and so does my husband, David. And this is before we were married, but David and I were really thinking about the role that education plays and the access to information. The internet and, search engines were really at the beginning. Teachers today, you want to go online and Google Paul Pfeiffer, Tara Walker, Mark Bradford, Mark Johnson, couldn't do it. So how do we create an opening and a pathway and a way for teachers to have access to multicultural artists? And so this was the very first project that I worked on with Carlos. He knew his own limitations, and he knew that he didn't quite have the skill set and really even the imagination to understand how to create a technology that would provide access for teachers to these different kinds of artists from different backgrounds that you couldn't, at the time, if teachers wanted to put together a lecture or a class around Native American artists or Asian American artists, you'd have to either do first-person interviews or do these discrete zines that, like if you were lucky enough to encounter this kind of scholarship, or they'd have to be published. It was either formal or super DIY, and not a lot in between. So Carlos knew that in order for students to have access to multicultural education in art history. We needed to find a way to kind of diversify what was being taught in the classroom. So he asked me to come on board to help form the Worlds in Collision website, which would take the principles and values of the Worlds in Collision class and symposia and public programming that Mark is talking about online. But he wasn't envisioning it as a user-based app. He was thinking about it as an app for teachers. We literally were creating class guides for teachers to use. And then we were interviewing and getting slides from Black artists in DC and Latinx artists in LA and Irish artists who were practicing in the Bay Area, who were all thinking and making work about these alternative histories and experiences that you couldn't find in published matter. This is the first project that I really sunk my teeth into with Carlos and under the banner of Worlds in Collision. I was one of the co-directors along with Julio Morales, and David Goldberg was our tech director, and so David built out the website itself.
And what years was that, Trisha?
That was 96, 90, 90. It was before I did the exhibition for the San Francisco State's Gallery. So it was probably 95, 96. I was working at the San Francisco Urban Institute. This is all preamble to this exhibition. All of this work, it was ongoing. It's decades long. Carlos started it in the 60s, really, when he was in school. These questions, why are some things taught in the classroom and others not? And what are the stories and histories that are being left out? Singularly devoting himself and the way that he worked with others to uncover and excavate these histories that were really difficult to engage with for students, for teachers, for other artists. This is the biggest kind of lesson that I learned from Carlos, is like how to do this kind of work. Today, it really is at the center of my own practice. You meet these others, we call each other, the School of Carlos Villa. And so when Carlos passed, there were so many other students like me who wanted to honor his memory and his leadership, his way of bringing us together. And so in many ways, this exhibition became a place and a receptacle for us to gather and to honor his memory.
It seems like you would have had to sort of tune to a slightly different channel, in that he was not so much like drawing attention to his own work. And it was interesting to me, Trisha, what you said earlier about seeing those canvases from the 80s and not even being aware that he had made that body of work. There must have been many surprises for you in taking on a retrospective project. What were you familiar with going in, and what were the things that you learned and maybe were surprised by?
Because I'm older, I remember seeing Carlos's work on display in the 1970s. So during that, fantastic, fabulous, feathered moment. Also, from speaking to Carlos, I knew about this dramatic change. He's like many artists, his work changed dramatically in different periods. And I'd heard about some of the works from the 1950s and 1960s, but it was really when we started working for the retrospective that we finally saw work from the 1950s and 1960s. After military service in Korea in the mid-1950s, he matriculated as a student at the school where he later taught. It was then called the California School of Fine Arts and became the San Francisco Art Institute in 1961. And he was embraced by the Beat era. Even Bruce Conner gave a stamp on one of his pieces that was the Rat Bastard Protective Association, which was kind of a Beat era moniker of cool. So he knew who would become very prominent artists, including, a two-person exhibition with Joan Brown. He then got a graduate degree at Mills College, and his work then was abstract expressionist. He became friends at that time with both Jennifer Bartlett and Elizabeth Murray. I had never seen that work before, and it's a really interesting period. Carlos later said he felt his really mature work starts in 1969, but I would now argue with him and say, no, right from the beginning, you can see this incredible intensity of vision and, really powerful contribution. In the 1960s, he moved to New York City in 1964 and lived there until 1969. It was a more reductive period. And although he was making a lot of sculpture then, and he did not retain the sculpture, that's one of the bodies of work that he discarded when he moved back to San Francisco. We did find hundreds of super interesting drawings from that period, and we were able to include 6 or so of those drawings in the Newark presentation, and you can start to see him move away from the reductive to this more organic and kind of visceral response that happens when he finally arrives back in San Francisco in 1969. So again, I think that whole period, I'd never seen any of it before. I didn't really know about it. That's a sort of a 15-year moment that we showed a little bit of, and I look forward to people examining that in greater depth in the future.
For me, what was surprising is beginning to see the arc of the questions that Carlos was posing for himself and answering for himself in some cases that I may have been familiar with, like the feathered work, but I didn't really understand what it meant to him in this moment of making, really putting it in a timeline that was so meaningful and revealed so much for me that I wasn't expecting. So while I may have been familiar with the painted cloak, which is such a regal, dramatic work that we included both in the East and West Coast, I didn't understand that he made it almost as soon as he returned from New York to San Francisco. So really thinking about the dramatic shift of the minimal way in which he was working, as Mark has mentioned, in New York. There we have this great photo that we included as part of the timeline at the Asian Art Museum, where you see Carlos barefoot in his studio in New York, and these kind of funky, minimal shaped, graphically formed sculptures on the floor of his studio. Then looking just a couple years ahead at these resplendent, it's one of my favorite works because I'm from Hawaii. That's influenced by the ahu'ula, right? So the Hawaiian feather cape that the ali'i wore, and he's making one for himself, right? And again, this Mark saying using his own body to make these marks on the canvas, and then making this garb, right? Like these clothes, these garments for his own Filipino body, leaving a record, like using his figure to record his own figure and his own Filipino-ness in the art historic record. I didn't put all of that together when I had just seen the work. I knew it existed, but to understand when he made it, in 71, just after returning from New York, he's on fire and so excited by the Black Panthers doing work, organizing, on the ground in the Bay, the occupation of Alcatraz, the Filipino community coming together and really doing community work on the ground. This is the moment that Carlos stepped into in 69 when he got back to the Bay. And this is what he was responding to. And this is from where he was making this work, so that was super important to me, that coming together and really just really kind of filling in the blanks, right? And then being able to interpret in the record, writing and then storytelling to others, being able to talk about that aspect of his own timeline and history was really important.
Trisha was just speaking about the painted cloak as one of the early works from the period after Carlos returned. And one thing that we've enjoyed so much about the process of making the exhibition is sharing it with different audiences. One of the audiences that we shared it with was with very young children.
This is probably one of my favorite aspects of being a curator and an exhibition maker is, as Mark's saying, sharing it with others, but particularly with different age groups. And at the Asian Art Museum, we had the opportunity to tour, really 5-year-olds to seniors through the exhibition. And each time it afforded us the opportunity to kind of think about the work and Carlos's story from their perspective. I'd always start with the cloak in the gallery and ask 5-year-olds, for instance, why do you think a Filipino American who lives in the Tenderloin would want to make himself a cape like this? Because it made him into a superhero. We're like, who else has a cape? Well, Superman, of course. Well, why would a Filipino guy want to be a superhero? And they're like, well, maybe he didn't feel important. And this made him feel like he had superpowers. Just one banger after another. Yes, they just got it 100%, right? How do you make yourself feel important? How do you make yourself be seen? And then ask the question, who else had a cloak that gave him superpowers, and the room's kind of buzzing with, kind of talking to each other. Who could it be? Well, Harry Potter, right? So Harry Potter had the cloak of invisibility. Well, they all went crazy. Just kind of making these connections for folks, and particularly younger audiences, and trying to make the work relatable to them, and then reminding them, hey, you can make your own cape, cloak, garment, magic, whatever robe to bestow yourself with whatever powers you want.
I love the idea of you sort of switching also your interpretive lens according to the particular audience that you're relating to with a project like this that is very, a retrospective that's so grounded in his biography and the exact history that he experienced and the moment the generation he was born into, and all of the correlations going through his life, and specifically understanding that what it is to be Asian American, what it is to be Filipino American is experienced differently by each generation. Since you did present this exhibition to so many different audiences, how do you feel that young Filipinx people today receive Via's work versus, older audiences?
It's a good question. And, we received such a outpouring of positivity, and the kind of feedback that we got from the Filipinx community in the Bay Area, as expected, was overwhelming. And I say as expected because, really the Bay Area is a major beating heart for the Filipino diaspora. There's nothing quite like the history and the volume of creativity that stems from the Bay Area and the Filipinx communities. And this is Carlos's home court. So we knew that folks were waiting to plug in and to learn more. And the kind of next gen, these are folks that I didn't, work with directly as I was kind of doing work in my career, but these are folks who are kind of emerging in their own education and in their own practices, community and arts workers that were coming up to me or reaching out on social media to say that this exhibition was groundbreaking, for them, and such a game changer. Imagine the very first Black American exhibition ever, and being there to pay witness to the first Native American exhibition ever. And it's not a race, but it is certainly a story of who's been left out and has been invited to the table and who's yet to eat. It really was exciting hearing from these emerging voices that they never thought that they would see somebody who looked like them on the front of a museum. They never thought that they would be able to relate to a story of immigration, of shame, of self-loathing, of pride. All these things that Carlos talked about in his work, they just never thought that they would have the opportunity to look and to be included in that way. That was 100% like Carlos's goal, not centering his own story or work, but to see ourselves reflected in these institutions that have great power to include and exclude, to bring Carlos's story as the first. That really, I think, was groundbreaking for a lot of the next gen.
How was it in Newark? It probably was a different interaction with audiences in the Newark, New York area who perhaps were not as familiar. Did you have to take a different approach? Did you adjust the show at all, or think about the different audiences in terms of their familiarity, not just with him as an individual, but maybe also him in his context going from San Francisco to New York and back?
We want to commend the institutions that were supportive. The Art Institute, of course, Carlos is part of their history. That was why they were on board. But Jay Shu, the director of the Asian Art Museum, and Abby Chen, curator of contemporary art, have set a new course for the Asian Art Museum to be a museum of Asian and Asian American art. And this is a very old school museum with a whole long history, founded with the Avery Brundage collection in the late 1950s as part of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, because of course San Francisco has been presenting exhibitions from Asia since the late 19th century. But it's a very difficult and different thing to embrace Asian American as a core mission statement. And this show was part of this new vision for that museum. Trisha Bloom at Newark has been doing such incredible work to diversify the story. Newark has a great collection of American art. She has done so much to transform that vision to being really inclusive, different stories, a diverse story, wonderful things with Native American art in the museum. And so it was through that connection that we approached her, and she was so supportive. Of course, Newark is kind of like a wonderful city in its rich diversity. There's a strong Filipino American presence in Newark and Jersey City. One of the reasons, besides Trisha's outstanding reputation, was that Theo Gonzalez from the Smithsonian said, don't forget, the big population in the East Coast Center is right there. The two institutions were different, and I wanted to maybe just talk for also a minute about, goes back to your previous question. Carlos lived through so many changes. Earlier we talked about the move to New York, and then he returned in 1969 at the moment of Third World Liberation. That was the term that was used. It was a campus strike at San Francisco State and the University of California, Berkeley, to diversify the curriculum. And Carlos's work of that period, like the work that referenced the Ahu'ula, that was not Filipino culture that it was referencing. It was Pacific Islander Hawaiian culture that was being referenced. One of the objects that I always would speak about is the Kurdaicha referenced shoes, artist feet with feathers, that references a sacred piece of clothing worn by the Kurdaicha, the spiritual practitioners in Aboriginal Australia. So there's the Third World Liberation that's referencing global colonized cultures that became multiculturalism and a kind of internationalism, diversity, equity, inclusion, so this whole arc. And you can see intellectually how all of those moments impact his work as he retreats actually from the work that's referencing the entire quote unquote third world to work that's much more specifically addressing his own Filipino American identity. In terms of educational things relating to building an exhibition, which is what we're talking about largely here, I did want to mention about the Kurdaicha shoes. Carlos was specifically inspired by a pair that his friend Tom Seligman, who was then curator at the DeYoung Museum, showed to him in the permanent collection. We thought, well, let's have an image of the original shoes that Carlos saw and was inspired, the feathered shoes in this ethnographic collection. We wrote the Aboriginal Australian Authority to request permission for this reproduction, and they said under no circumstances should they be ever reproduced. They are so sacred, they should never be exhibited or even images of them shared. So that was also an interesting thing for us. And of course, Carlos moved away from referencing that stuff. But I think when he made that work, in the very early 1970s, those conversations were not happening anywhere yet. So he was sort of ahead of the curve, but then again withdrew from that.
We knew that Trisha Bloom would be the kind of curator who would understand how to position Carlos within the context and longer timeline of American history, of American art history. We knew that she would be an ally in this work. Trisha Bloom would be able to safeguard the way in which Carlos worked and was thinking and was referencing all of these different cultures. And she certainly was. The other thing that I knew we would have to do that would be different from the West Coast was bring in somebody who had the kind of commitment to Filipinx American art and art history and culture making and community building as I did in San Francisco. And that's when I reached out to Nancy Bulalakaw of The Quiet Before and previously of the Filipino American Museum. I just met her like in the last 3 years, but I had heard about her 10 years ago when she was working on FAM. The Filipino American Museum, there was all a buzz and everybody was talking about this incredible fire in her belly, just real firecracker of a community leader who was galvanizing the film community of creatives in New York, including folks that I was friends with, like Paul Pfeiffer and Teresa Navarro. I was familiar with her work already, and I asked her if she would take the reins and really shape public programming and pull in her contacts and community, which is what I knew that we'd need, because the Newark Museum had never worked with the Filipino American community before. So this was an opportunity for them, but I knew that we would really need somebody who was knowledgeable and connected who could hit the ground running. And Nancy absolutely was such an incredible ally and thought partner through this whole process. Mark and I have also talked about how we know that Carlos would have loved showing at the Newark Museum, because anybody who wanted to come to see the show would have to make their way on the PATH train or however else, to make their way over that river to see the show. And, kill horror for Manhattanites or Brooklynites to make it out to this faraway land called, Newark. It's like, where's that? And we just love this idea of like people putting in the work, and for Carlos and for this history, that they want to learn more about, to make it to this institution that isn't exactly one of the top 10 museums to visit in Manhattan or Brooklyn.
Can you talk more about the approach towards audience building, audience interpretation, reaching out to communities? What kinds of public programs were important for you to happen?
Well, one of the partners that we made with the Newark iteration was with Alexandra Chang, who's at Rutgers. Alex worked with the student body and with the museum. Nancy really ended up being the kind of lead for the Newark Museum on this, but taking in oral histories. So this was one way that we had envisioned engaging with Filipinx American visitors and community members with this exhibition, and a way to kind of capture this moment and make use of those who were visiting the exhibition, talking about Carlos, but also just talking about their own experiences as Filipinx Americans. That I think was super important, and it had a place in the gallery, just, that was adjacent to the main hall that presented Carlos's work. There was a timeline, and there were videos that shared different voices talking about their own immigration or just their own personal histories as Filipinx Americans. So that was one facet of public programming in Newark that was really important. Nancy just did an incredible job of drawing on folks from John Santos, who's a designer and creative DJ who kind of toggles between New York and Hawaii. Paul Pfeiffer. Paul is actually somebody who worked closely with Carlos. So it's really letting Nancy lead the way. There was an incredible community day that she invited in different dance groups to perform. This was all new for the Newark Museum. And then on the West Coast, at the Asian Art Museum, I assembled what I call my dream team of thinkers, makers, dreamers, Jennifer Wofford and Leanne Ladia and PJ Gubatina Policarpio and Tea Kiwetagle to think about public programming for Carlos's hometown. That could have gone on. We could do that every year. It was so well embraced and attended. And that was a performance, kind of a second line parade from the Asian Art Museum on opening weekend to the San Francisco Arts Commission galleries of dancers in the street playing music, starting with Alleluia Panes in the galleries, kind of christening the show and opening up the way for ancestors to come down, including Carlos at the Asian Art Museum, and then moving to the Arts Commission galleries. I mean, it really was taking up a lot of space. To, Kim Arteshi, so Tea Kiwetagle, Thea organized a performance of local Bay Area performer Kim Arteshi to do an offering. She was commissioned to do a work at the Arts Commission Gallery that was about, again, like calling down the spirits and making offerings to ancestors, starting with Carlos, so it was really emotional, spiritual. I just felt like this is the brain trust. I felt so lucky to be able to be in a position to invite them in and to dream along with Mark and I and so many others of like, okay, if we were to honor Carlos, what would that look like? And that looks like inviting in the poet laureate for San Francisco, Tango Eisen Martin, to do a closing reading for us.
What a guy. One of the great poets, I think, in America today.
Tim Shuck, another former San Francisco poet laureate, opened the opening weekend.
Who's Native American Cherokee and a great weaver herself, basket weaver.
Did all these people know Carlos?
A lot of people did not know him, but many of them did. In both communities, there was a huge amount of support from a diverse Filipino American Italian-centric, but really diverse body. Several parts of this still exist. Of course, one is the catalog, and I want to recognize Sherwin Rio, who was just finishing his MFA, who became so central to the development of the catalog, somebody who was not even 30 yet, playing a major role. And then one more time, Theo Gonzalez, because there is still a Google Art and Culture page timeline. And the timeline was presented at Newark on the wall, so you could read it and interact with it in that way. But when it came to the Asian Art Museum, it was presented as a Google Art and Culture page, as well as on the wall. Check out Carlos Villa, Worlds in Collision, and hear 7 narrations that's so fantastic. One other thing that still exists that will be there hopefully for a very long time is an incredible mural that was commissioned by the Luggage Store Gallery in San Francisco, painted by Mario Ayala and others, that is Carlos's face, 10 stories tall, looming above the neighborhood where he grew up. That's part of the San Francisco story, as well as this presentation at multiple venues.
Rachel Lastimosa is the performer who led us in a kind of second line, like parade, connecting the Asian Art Museum with the Arts Commission Gallery on opening weekend. There's no shortage of folks who we could have called on, and we did call on, and it really was such a tsunami of love. It was a love bubble, the whole project. There were moments, of course. It's not easy to build a project of this scope and scale, and not everyone's going to agree on how to tell the story of a single artist who was so embedded in multiple communities through generations. I've talked to Victoria Sung, who is the lead curator for the Pasita Abad exhibition, about what it means to be a legacy bearer. And I've talked to Pio Abad about this as well, who's, Pasita Abad's nephew, and also doing this important work to carry Pasita's story forward. It's tricky and sticky. In the Dream Team public program committee for the San Francisco venues, we talked about this concept of sticky rice in community work. So this idea that you can't just pick up one grain of rice. With sticky rice, there's a clumping that happens. So you have to pick up like a whole mess of folks. When you do work about Carlos, he doesn't come alone. There's all kinds of histories and stories and other folks that you need to bring along with him. And again, all media is constructed. When you include some stuff, it means that you're excluding other stuff.
Could you both talk a bit more about the creation of the book? Because Mark, as you point out, the book is such a lasting accomplishment, such a major contribution. And, for those of us who are lucky enough to see the show, fantastic. But for so many others who did not experience it in person, the book is the record of this incredible project. And I know it must have been a big lift and involved tons of people. So would love to hear from both of you about how you approached creating the publication and who you brought into it.
First, we want to thank the funders. And so the book is largely funded by the Andy Warhol Foundation. Whenever you do a catalog like this, you need subvention money, and UC Press had said yes right off the bat, but there was also a fee. We were lucky to have that support. There was a lot of new photography that needed to happen as well. Then in terms of inviting essayists, there are multiple perspectives represented by the essays. Paul Karlstrom was the former West Coast Regional Director of the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian Institution, and he had done a multi-part interview with Carlos in the mid-1990s at the sort of conclusion of Carlos's big multicultural Sources of a Distinct Majority series. And it was so rich because it also included a lot of Carlos's reflections about his own background and how he grew up, including the fact that when he was young, he was encouraged by his parents not to speak Ilocano because people might mistake them for being Japanese during World War II. So there was that sort of internalized self-loathing. So anyway, Paul wrote a biographical essay that tackled some very difficult topics in Carlos's biography. Margot, of course, is a major collaborator with Carlos over decades, and so was able to make that contribution as well. Some people who didn't even know Carlos, like Patrick Flores, the great scholar from Manila, who had helped bring Carlos's work to an international audience at the Singapore Biennale. So multiple different kind of writers, but we also decided, because the exhibition couldn't cover really the whole arc of his work, so we had some special portfolio sections. One dealt with a lot of the feathered work that was destroyed because feathers inherently attract pests, and Carlos didn't have archival storage for this work. At a certain point, he destroyed a lot of it, but there were wonderful photographs. So there's that section, a section of his drawings that showed how he came up with some of the work that included the tributes to his Manong, the earlier generation of immigrants, that incorporated a wonderful poetic idiom called pontoon poems. So, like many artists around 1990, the use of text in their work became of interest. So Carlos, as a way to make this reflect specifically Oceania perspective, employed a Malaysian poetic form called the pontoon, which repeats certain lines, and he kind of created this concrete poetry by using plates, either brass or aluminum plates, like a trophy plate that was inscribed, and embedded that in the work, sometimes in the form of I Ching trigrams, or sometimes in the format of ladders in a body of work called Family Witnessing. So anyways, a lot of that is represented in the catalog that wasn't even in the exhibition, just to give a slightly broader perspective on who he was and what he did. And again, I want to recognize UC Press for having the vision to take this on and help make such a beautiful book.
I also want to thank UC Press for taking on this project, and, shout out Mark, because this is probably like his third publication with the press, and it's one of the reasons why the door was open to begin with. I will say that Mark and I remember this is before the pandemic, and we were having a kind of Zoom meeting with all the powers that be to make some decisions about like the front cover, which, this, Melissa, that is like it's an important facet to the project. What
high stakes decision.
Yeah, it's high stakes decision. Mark and I were on the same page about a certain work, this kind of really luxe detail of one of Carlos's feathered pieces that really included a lot of like earthy rust and black color, and it was just gorgeous. It was on the board, but that was our first pick, and the press actually vetoed our recommendation and really felt strongly about the cover that made it to the press, which is this image that was also used in the mural at the luggage store, this tattoo image, and it's Carlos's early work of pen on e-tech print, a self-portrait, where he's using these like imagined tattoo designs on his own face. This is the cover that they wanted to use. And Mark and I were like, well, but honestly, they were right. In the end, it's like to see Carlos, like his visage, his Filipino American face on the front cover of this record of his work is really important, and to see it staring back at you,
yes,
exactly as he intended in the work itself, but from the bookshelf or online, that's really key. We haven't yet talked about a story where Mark and I typically start with telling of making of this exhibition, which is, in so many ways, Carlos's story begins with him growing up in the Tenderloin and all of that. But when he gets to art school and he's in painting class, and he asks one of his painting teachers, where can I find more information on Filipino American art and art history? His painting teacher, Walt Coleman, answers him by saying, there isn't any. That's patently untrue. Carlos makes this the singular drive, and it becomes this engine for his work. All of the Worlds in Collision work, recording his own body and using his body as an implement to apply paint to the canvas. I mean, making casts of his body, making cloaks for his body. So much of it was like, well, where can I look to find information on Filipino American art history? Well, this is a record now, right? So the catalog is now part of the answer to that question.
That quote, I think, is just such a moving one for so many of us, one that has a shock of recognition. And this idea that the animating force for him was to exactly seek out and create what the Academy would not or could not teach him, and that he dedicated the rest of his life to discovering it and creating it for himself and for others. That's such an interesting story about the cover of the book. And I love the fact that the outcome is, like you say, his face, such a meaningful motif within his oeuvre. To be the focus of the cover is extraordinary.
We can name Nadine Little from UC Press, who was the person who, said, no, you guys are wrong, and this is a better idea. And Nadine was right.
Yeah, and while we're shouting people out, I mean, Elisa Isaacson, who led the way with fundraising efforts at the San Francisco Art Institute. We worked so closely with her. She understood San Francisco Art Institute's story and Carlos's place in it, and it was really the kind of driving force behind securing the Warhol Foundation support for this project, which funded the catalog. I mean, it takes a village for sure, right?
That's actually something I was curious about, the fundraising, because the fundraising for something like this is a major endeavor. It sounds like the first institutional yes was San Francisco Art Institute, and then you were able to work with people there on getting all the really impressive amount of foundational support that the project got. Is that how it unfolded?
SFAI was definitely the first lead partner. And of course, we have to recognize that COVID was a really important roadblock. The roadblock was so intense that it basically destabilized the San Francisco Art Institute, which has recently declared bankruptcy. The Art Institute ultimately didn't make it to the finish line of the project, but the Art Institute played such an important role in getting us started. And then we went with the then president to speak to Jay and Abby at the Asian. And because we realized that the Art Institute did not have climate control, so there were certain museum loans that were not going to be possible at that venue. And then the Asian Art Museum agreed to come on as a collaborative co-sponsor. Some of the funding, like the loose funding, came through the Asian, and some of the funding, like the NEA and Warhol and Carpenter, came through the Art Institute. So it was from multiple sides. There were also some individuals who were very supportive. Malu Babilonio made a significant gift, which we really appreciate. Of course, Newark had to raise their own funds to do it on their own, but that's sort of a snapshot of funding.
I know this, the thinking on this started way before COVID, but did that also impact your ability to create a checklist and see all the works and all the collections that you needed to visit and things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, we did a lot of work in masks. The show was supposed to open in 2021, as I mentioned, to celebrate the 150th anniversary, but that was a year of COVID closure. So it was pushed back a year, opened first at Newark instead of in the Bay Area because of it. Even at Newark, there was supposed to be only 10 people in the gallery at a time. It impacted us in a major way.
We had initially envisioned the exhibition to open at dual locations at the Art Institute and the Asian Art Museum simultaneously first. It was going to be a major kind of moment in bringing together community. And we quickly realized, through the pandemic that wasn't going to be possible. So the switch in putting Newark first was in part to delay the opening in San Francisco in the hopes that the COVID regulations would be relaxed in order for us to have the kind of community celebration that we really wanted. I think it worked out the way that it could have and should have. We were super happy with the turnout on both coasts, but it was awkward. I mean, we did all of the planning, almost all of it online. We had like a couple of meetings at the Asian Art Museum before we went into lockdown, but that was it. It was just kind of the pitch meetings, getting stuff sewn up with the contract, and then we went into lockdown. We continued to plan through the pandemic. It was odd. The first time I met some of my colleagues at the Asian Art Museum in person was when we were installing.
Were the two of you involved in the installation design on both coasts?
Yes.
I would say Yes, but I think all venues basically did a lot of planning themselves. Eventually, the Art Institute was closed. Trisha previously had worked at the Arts Commission in San Francisco. And so, largely through her connection to the institution to replace the Art Institute after it collapsed, we were so lucky and pleased that the San Francisco Arts Commission main gallery took a piece of the exhibition. Each venue sort of shaped the exhibition distinctively to meet their audiences. So the most holistic presentation was Newark because it went kind of soup to nuts, had a painting from 1959 and then a painting from shortly before Carlos's passing. So it was really the full retrospective. But in San Francisco, the Asian Art Museum really focused on the decade of the 1970s primarily, which was this spectacular moment of the feathers and ethnographic kind of referenced work. And then the Arts Commission showed some of the body impression pieces, but really focused a lot on the references to the Manong, the elder generation of Filipino Americans that Carlos grew up with as his quote unquote uncles, and a special installation that incorporated photographs of the community that Carlos called family witnessing. It had a very specific community kind of orientation and was co-sponsored by Soma Pilipinas, which is the South of Market Cultural District for the Filipino community.
I'd like to invite you to talk more about animating themes or topics within Via's work and by extension, the show. One that's come up already is this experience of self-loathing that he suffered as a young person. And maybe to put a finer point on this transition back from New York to San Francisco, which seems like such a catalytic moment for him creatively. Would love to have one of you pick up on that big moment of change in his outlook and in his art making.
Of course, the 1960s were extremely dynamic in Northern California in particular. The 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island by Indians of all tribes, the 1966 founding in Oakland of the Black Panther Party, the 1966 founding of the farm workers movement that was initiated by Filipino Americans like Larry Itliog. Carlos was tracking all of this long distance from New York. Then by the time of the university strikes in 1968-69, he decided he wanted to come back and participate in that kind of cultural zeitgeist moment, and then had that incredible transformation in his work where his work became exuberant and fabulous and referencing colonized culture. So it's an sort of an early anti-colonial moment. And then he made his own personal identity, his own personal experience central by making body impressions, body casts. You know, there's a wonderful performance from 1980 called Ritual in which he, in public, strips naked, covers his body with paint and makes these body impressions on a canvas after taking off one of those spectacular feathered robes. Then by the 1990s, then the work takes this very, very different direction. It becomes more reductive and often using door format works that were painted black that references the doors of the International Hotel, which was a residence hotel for senior Manong in the Little Manila neighborhood of Chinatown for these bachelor. And the Bachelor Society was because, you know, people from the 20s and 30s were invited, men were invited to come as laborers, women were not. And then because of miscegenation laws, those same men could not marry outside of their own Filipino American community. So they were without families and alone. And Carlos made this incredible body of work that is his sort of love letter to the pain of that generation. And kind of throughout that, he is dealing with issues of loneliness and self-loathing, as you mentioned. Into the 21st century, you know, we had talked about Carlos had a minimalist moment in the 60s as he was in New York City and participating with huge figures. He was quite close with Bryce Martin. Trisha and I were just talking the other day about he remembers sitting at Max's Kansas City and talking to Dan Flavin and in his own mind saying, I don't care about fluorescent light bulbs. And so that's why he came back. But his work did return to a minimal orientation, in part because of a great tragedy in his own family where his daughter was incarcerated. This caused a real quieting kind of his very late work.
I started working with Carlos and Mark in like 96, something like that. And by the late 90s and 98 or something, Carlos would have these regular meetings, community meetings, project meetings in his studio. He'd feed us, we'd listen to music, we'd talk story, we'd plan if we got around to that. And his work was there. He was making the work. So we were often like the first audience, and we could ask questions. I mean, I wish I could find these photographs that we took in his studio with the doors during this time when we were planning and organizing the San Francisco Babaylan exhibition that was going to Manila, because it was like all of the, artists in the exhibition practically were there. Catherine Wagner and Lucille Tenazes and the brides. It was just an incredible moment. We were kind of like putting on the fedora hats in Carlos's work and like getting photographed with them. I mean, it was bananas. It was the first time as a Filipino American myself seeing my own kind of reflection, and they were such internal private thoughts of my own identity. It was the first time I ever saw another artist, a Filipinx artist, thinking about and saying out loud self-loathing. But where does the self-loathing come from? It's this white supremacy. It's the contrast of our brownness and our kayumangi skin, our brown skin against whiteness. It's the contrast of where we come from and that we're foreigners, in this place where we're born. It's the experience of being a part of a diaspora and always reaching behind you for something that you don't know, looking for the ground beneath you. I've described to Mark the experience of being a part of the diaspora, of like when you're bobbing up and down in the surf, because I'm from Hawaii, so I know this feeling quite intimately. When the tide rises and it falls and you can feel the sand beneath you until that next wave comes again and it kind of lifts you up and you're bobbing up and down and you can sometimes feel the ground. That's what it felt like for me, as a member of the diaspora, where my mother was born in the Philippines, my father was born in the territory of the US in Hawaii before it was a state, and I was born in Hawaii, after statehood. Having all these friends, being raised in a Filipino community of immigrants and also first and second geners, we all had different ways of relating to the motherland. And Carlos gave speech and, manifested this complexity of relationship to place and to ancestry, to history, to our own bloodline, and to white supremacy that I didn't have for myself. In looking at this work, I felt suddenly released, and like emboldened to be in my own feelings and experience. I wanted to shout out, Lisa Alexander and Marcy Kwan and their Asian American Art Alliance or initiative work at Stanford, because, the convening that happened last year at that weekend-long symposia, I really felt like it was this moment where there's so many exhibition makers like me and Mark and you that were finally talking about this place where we can include ourselves as part of the work, right? Like we don't have to have this kind of 19th century anthropological arm's length, can't include your own perspective BS in thinking and working through this scholarship and this research. Yes, there's a place for my own subjectivity, my own selfhood, my own positionality with regard to this subject, which happens to be another Filipinx American. Carlos created that space for me to even look at myself. And I had that same self-loathing experience. Though he may have been talking about the Manongs, I think that it's something that he talked about with me too, that he found in himself. It's like, okay, it's okay for us to talk about. We have to talk about it, in fact. We have to make work about it. We have to write about it. So it's this, again, Carlos, like opening the door for others to come in and examine and write and make together.
And talk about it in mixed company, so to speak, like to bring it out beyond just like the intimate circle of one's own community. That's also this additional step, the entering of his work now into the larger record, a broader record of American art history. That's one of the great importances of a project like this. I also recall from that weekend at Stanford, Trisha, how often that fact that you just pointed out came up, that it was okay to sort of recognize that one's personal subjective experience moving through the world, being who we are, is something that informs our professional work, our creative work, our curatorial work. So that had not really been spoken out loud so forcefully for me as well until that time. So Speaking of curatorial work, I don't want us to miss out on an opportunity to talk about other sources, especially with 2026 around the corner. It just seems like a great opportunity to think through that project of Carlos Villa's, because of course that was organized in the bicentennial year, 1976. May I ask both of you, experts in Carlos Villa, about that project and to address, how groundbreaking it was and why its legacy is still so alive now.
I saw the exhibition. I unfortunately didn't attend the public programs, and now I am so aware of how incredible the public programs were. Robert Colescott gave a performance that I've actually seen on video that is unbelievable. And Winston Tong performed with dolls, a piece he entitled Bound Feet that later won an award on Broadway when he took it there. Isaac Wong did a performance working with textile, but I did see the exhibition. The exhibition, of course, was crowded into the same gallery that we had hoped to present this exhibition of Carlos's work at the San Francisco Art Institute, and it was an exhibition of artists of color. One of the hallmarks of the exhibition was that Carlos also hand typed everybody's phone numbers on copy paper, that he would give away, because the whole point was to promote and create opportunities for other artists. And it was the first time that I became aware of many artists' work. Subsequently, I've reviewed the checklist many times. It was an exhibition that was not curated thematically. It was an exhibition that was curated conceptually to shine a light on those important stories that were outside of the mainstream. For Native American artists, Linda Loma Haftawa, the great Hopi Tiwa artist, was included. She was then teaching in the Bay Area. Later, she went back to Santa Fe, taught at IAIA for many years. But also somebody named Frank Day. Frank Day died shortly thereafter. He was an elder, but he was a self-taught artist and working in, we call naive painting style, to tell the stories that he remembered from his father and things that he had seen himself as a kid within the American Indian community in California. The American Indian story in California was so made invisible until Alcatraz. It was, of course, spectacular as an exhibition, but it also advanced work that another curator in the Bay Area named Rolando Castellón had been advancing. Rolando was one of the founders of the Galleria de la Raza in San Francisco in 1970, and then was hired as the MIX multicultural curator at SF MoMA. And he did a wonderful project, Third World Painting and Sculpture, in 1974. And he's still around. He's in his 90s now. He was originally from Nicaragua, and he's currently living in San Juan, Costa Rica. Really deserving of attention as well. After the Carlos Villa show, one of the wonderful people who used to work at the museum came up to me and said, "We should do something for Rolando," because again, he's a giant who was similar in age to Carlos, and and helped inform Carlos's 1976 project.
Flanking Carlos's career, at the beginning, he organizes in 1976 other sources in American essay at the San Francisco Art Institute to think about, who's left out of American history. And on the backside of his career in 2010, he organizes another exhibition just a few years before his passing called Rehistoricizing Abstract Expressionism in the Bay Area, 1950s to 1960s. And there are actually some artists, including Ruth Asawa and Bernice Bing, who were in both exhibitions that he curated. When Mark and I would give tours at the Asian Art Museum of the Worlds in Collision exhibition, I pointed out in the timeline this capstone, this bookend to Carlos's curatorial career, Rehistoricizing ABEX, because he was always thinking about who was left out of the story.
Yes.
The very first exhibition and the last, who wasn't written into this history. And I think it's interesting that he included some of the same artists. They fit into both of these narratives. The Rehistoricizing Abstract Expressionism exhibition, which I know, Mark, you also worked with him on.
Yes.
Joan Brown and Ruth Asawa and Bernice Bing, Luis Cervantes. It's a reminder that for everyone who's included as part of art history, there are 10 more stories that have yet to be told. And with this exhibition, with Worlds in Collision, Mark and I started getting questions about what about so-and-so. This is in the spirit of Carlos's approach to equity work, really. I mean, we think about it now as diversity, equity, and inclusion work. That wasn't the language we used when Carlos was launching this kind of multiculturalism work in the 70s. But that's exactly what he was looking to do, which is decolonize the classroom, the museum, our minds, our way of looking, to always think about like who's left out. Shout out to the Luggage Store Gallery for supporting Carlos and this really important exhibition that he did towards the end of his career.
Was there a sense of fluidity between all these different parts of his activity? We haven't talked in depth about his teaching. I'd love to hear more about that. But the curatorial work, the work to shine a light on, as you're saying, Trisha, so many worthy artists that have not been sort of brought into the narrative. And then, of course, his practice as a maker, as a hands-on maker. From the ground level experience, spending time with him, was there just complete fluidity between these parts of him, or were there certain, I don't know, periods, years where he was concentrating on one thing and then would pivot and turn to another?
I would say everything was everywhere all at once, but there was these moments of a focus. So, the 1976 project was a really significant project. And then in the late 80s, it was Angela Davis and Moira Roth who came together to talk to Carlos and said, you have this platform, which is the school, would you consider? So he always recognized them as part of the reason he returned to that. And then there was this incredible intense period from 1989 to 1994 that hosted 7 sources of a distinct majority conversations, which were generally weekend symposia with maybe 20 speakers at each one. And he developed a book called Worlds in Collision. And he was very proud of that first publication. That was the second kind of moment. Trisha was one of the speakers in Worlds in Collision 2 in 2001. A little bit later, Worlds in Collision 3, that was specifically a Filipino-American conversation. And then again, this final rehistoricizing project. I think he was always thinking, because it did impact his studio practice, because, he was up early and stayed up late, just coordinating details, because it's not like he had a staff. I mean, he had volunteers. I was a volunteer on a couple of those because I worked at the Art Institute, and so I was working closely with him. There wasn't a staff, a full-time staff. He did it, raising money, writing the grants to support all those things.
I also want to just shout out Jennifer Wofford. Jennifer is a Bay Area-based artist, educator, absolutely a member of the School of Carlos Villa. She studied with Carlos directly. I did not study with Carlos at SFAI. I am an alum. I did my undergraduate work there, as did Wofford, as we call her. But she went to the Art Institute in part to study with Carlos. And she really has modeled her teaching and her practice along the same lines that he taught and made. She's done lectures on him. She organized a symposium on Carlos at the Berkeley Art Museum before this exhibition came together and before the paintings were found in the attic. She's really helped to keep his memory and legacy alive, as have Leanne Ladia, who's now the program director, lead curator at 500 Cap Street. Thea Kiwitagle taught a class on Carlos. Carlos's legacy and his way of creating and connecting with others was never really put down. And sometimes it was kind of incredible. He was, I wouldn't even say unintelligible, but he had a way of talking like a beat poet. And sometimes you're we'd get out of these meetings and I'd turn to my fellow colleague, my friend, I would be like, what the hell was that? What was the agenda there? Some of it was he kind of left it to us to kind of sort out. I mean, working with Julio Morales a lot, these early morning meetings with Carlos and whoever else would show up, it really was sometimes seamless. He was the godfather. He'd spit his verse. To me, it was living poetry. Even the way in which he organized and led these meetings, there was a kind of cadence and a creativity to it.
We were just talking about Jennifer Wofford and her role in the mail order brides at the Asian Art Museum. There was a whole separate gallery of the next generation artists. I'm going to let Trisha talk about this gallery because this is something that she really pulled together.
So I'll say a couple of things. One, I off camera before we started this conversation talked about being in Berlin last week and seeing the Ulysses Jenkins exhibition, thinking about the role that community plays in Ulysses Jenkins practice and making these connections with Carlos and how central education, access, and community building was to Carlos, period, full stop, and how much I connected with both of these artists. And then also thinking about Ulysses Jenkins, as he studied under Charles White in LA, and Charles White had such a profound impact on so many artists. And Ulysses Jenkins also similarly had worked with so many Black artists today who are making incredible work. So thinking about that kind of the descendants, from like a school or a node or a teacher, and on and so on and so forth. In building this exhibition with Mark, it became clear that Carlos's story would be incomplete without placing real focus on his role as a teacher, as a leader, a space maker, as a world builder. Yes, let's place focus on his studio practice and raise that up 100%. But we absolutely need to also look at the students that he taught. There was Paul Pfeiffer, who studied directly with Carlos. It was Mike Arcega, also studied with Carlos at SFAI, Jennifer Wofford also. But these other artists who were in the room, so to speak, literally and adjacent to, so Leanne Ladia and Sherwin Rio. Sherwin, we talked about earlier, was the photo editor for the catalog. Sherwin never met Carlos. So just thinking about the way in which Carlos's signal continues to reach artists today, and he continues to have this impact, right? So Lee Gallery and then the Education Gallery next door held 8 contemporary artists who were all part of the school of Carlos Villa, whether they studied with Carlos directly or not. And, it included work by the Mail Order Brides. So they were commissioned to create a new work that they kind of started at Montalvo Art Center. They did a work with Carlos in 2010 called for Green Papaya Projects in Manila that was all about communication. So it was like a 4-channel video where each of the brides, there are 3 of them, Jennifer Wofford, Rihanna Estrada, and Eliza Barrios, were in dialogue with Carlos, the 4 of them together, and they were all in 4 corners of the earth. They're all in different places. And this is pre-Zoom, pre-FaceTime. There was one monitor nestled in a kind of hooded pedestal, and they were all facing in toward each other. They were all talking to each other, trying to talk to each other anyway, and passing these objects from one monitor to the next. So you'd see maybe like a mango going from one hand, and the next person would grab the mango and consider it, etc. It was called Chatsi Log Revisited. So the video that they made together with Carlos in 2010 was the center of this new work, and they added photography and new video. Their work is really surreal. It was kind of a lavender explosion of lavender drapes and lavender pedestals and lavender floor with these eggs. Silog in Filipino is a breakfast dish, and you can have all kinds of silog. So like a long silog is like longanisa with eggs and rice, and they made a chat silog. So chat is the meat. So chatting with each other is communication. They actually made these like fake food sculptures that were rotating atop each of the pedestals that displayed the monitor with each one of these different, members of the group talking to each other. So they made different symbols of communication, like ears, quotation mark, or speech bubbles, sort of look like sperm, these kind of Vincent van Gogh ears that were disembodied, on a plate, etc. So they made these chatsi log, and I love this idea of like eating together, communing together. This is like crucial to Carlos's way of making. And it was all for Carlos. They jokingly refer to themselves as the Carlos's angels. They had a long collaboration with Carlos. And in some ways, it kind of felt like they were communicating with him from beyond the grave. This work, Chatsilog, was a new piece that they created for the exhibition. And then Paul Pfeiffer, we included a couple of works there. Paul really felt strongly about including this work that he created. It's part of a longer series where he has taken this video of Manny Pacquiao, who's the famed boxer turned politician, and erases his opponent. So you're left seeing only this Filipino figure being assaulted. This is the work that we displayed for Paul's work. And then Mike Arcega and Paula Asuncion had this incredible mobile social sculpture called the TNT tricycle that is an actual motorcycle with sidecar that Mike Arcega owns, and it's activated in different ways. So they've used it during the pandemic to deliver food to those who were homebound, and decorated it much in the design style and tradition as of the jeepneys in the Philippines, right? So the like festooned and colorful, reflective, really celebratory. But in talking to them about it and riding in this tricycle, I really thought about this work as the body of an immigrant, bobbing and weaving in and out of traffic, hyper visible in some ways, but absolutely invisible depending on who's looking and who's engaging with it. And they also used it as a sound studio to interview different members of the Filipino American community in the Bay Area about their experience either with Carlos or their immigration experience. And from that footage, they are crafting a longer film out of this material. And they've also activated it as a karaoke station. We moved the sculpture into the Samsung Hall at the Asian Art Museum for one night only. And, some of the Asian Art Museum staff, the preparator staff, got to participate and do karaoke. And, just tons of people came in. It was a celebratory moment, but I don't want to stop short and really sell that work short by only describing it as a karaoke machine. It is so much more. It really represents and is able to embody all of the kind of contradictions of immigrant life and of the diaspora that we've discussed to date, that Carlos addressed and was unafraid to kind of uncover and go there. This work, the TNT tricycle, really allowed us to talk about tough things, but it has a kind of joyful side as well. And then Leah and Ladia and Sherwin Rio did an incredible piece in the education gallery where you could actually make your own cape for takeaway. And Leanne and Sherwin recreated works from the Carlos Villa archive that they pulled out that represented different public programs and actual artworks that Carlos made. One of my favorites is work called Make Teach. This is an actual artwork that Carlos made with stenciled text, Make and Teach, and they combine them together in one copper plate that really summarizes Carlos's whole ethos. He did not separate the studio from the classroom. It really was a beautiful offering, I felt like, for our generation and the next to pay tribute and honor this incredible, iconic teacher. And he wasn't perfect. Jennifer Wofford is always reminding us not to create a deity out of Carlos Villa. He's not a saint, right? But he certainly has left us with so many questions that I'm still trying to answer. And that, it's all about the questions, right?
Just listening to you just now, what I was visualizing was this incredibly complex family tree type diagram, trying to make all the connections between the sources of influence and then passing that on, and the people parallel and overlapping. What really stands out is this sense of his legacy having current life. It's a special kind of artist and teacher, I think, who is able to communicate with and be holding hands with people, not just one, but maybe 2 or 3 generations behind them, below them. And that's really what still is moving forward. Sometimes retrospectives, to get back to the exhibition, really feels like a closed book. And with Carlos, it doesn't feel that way. And I think that's something you were able to actualize. I'm really glad that we spent some time talking about the public programs, the sort of next generation gallery, those things, because that's what really underscores how alive he and his worldview. If anything, it's become amplified in recent years, it seems to me.
Closing things down, sunsetting this conversation around why next and next gen thinkers, makers, arts workers are drawn to Carlos's story. And I hope that in sharing the making of this exhibition, we're able to kind of shine a light on some of those reasons why I think Carlos is such an important figure in Asian American and American art history.
Carlos was also somebody who cared very much about rewriting the historical record. It was Carlos and Moira who suggested the symposium Expanding American Art History to Reflect Multi-Ethnic Diversity, which was a real place of shift for many people. This was something that brought people from very diverse backgrounds together, and to say, now that Georgia O'Keeffe finally made it into Jansen's, let's take the whole thing apart and rebuild it more inclusively. And that work continues today. And the people who were part of that process are many of the artists in the Bay Area, Rupert Garcia, Amalia Mesa Baines, but also people from outside. We'll never forget Bell Hooks coming in for residence for 10 days in a row, just actively asking questions, making suggestions, people from all different backgrounds. Michelle Wallace, Jean-Quick Dissy Smith. He's an intellectual giant as a public intellectual who had an incredible studio practice that paralleled his thinking, first in this way of reaching out and making the connections to the whole community, through his own artwork, as well as his own organizing, but then specifically honing it to lift up the Filipino-American experience.
He never put down the Filipino-American history piece. He partnered with UCSF and worked with Jennifer Wofford, who inherited his curriculum and taught a course on Filipino-American art history at USF. There are other artists who taught the class. And also, he was always connecting with other diasporic Filipinos, Manuel Ocampo, Santiago Bose, other artists who were coming through the Bay Area. His door was always open, and he'd create these parties and gatherings for Filipinos to come together. In many ways, I'm really an echo of the way that he worked, which is, again, general, and all boats rise, and we want to think about who's left out and focus on those voices to bring them to the table and lift them up, but also focusing on Filipino-American stories in art history. And there have been so many allies along the way, and he knew that he couldn't do it alone and didn't want to. And the story continues. That's one of the reasons why folks are drawn to his story still, is because he was so expansive and generous.
And just to say, part of the creation story is, it's sort of two parts. Number one, there was the teacher who said it doesn't exist. But then it was Carlos who said he drew inspiration always from his cousin, Leo Valador, that for him, he had a Filipino-American inspiration, and always, championed Leo's work, and then helped build an archive about other early Filipino-American history, and then promoted next generation. So, he's expanding things from both sides.
I just did a studio visit with Gina Osterloh at Headland Center for the Arts. She's in residence there right now. She lives and works in Ohio. So she is a teacher at Ohio State University. But she was telling me, she was a graffiti writer from like the early 90s into the turn of the century. Now she's an interdisciplinary artist, and she teaches photography at Ohio State. And, she's represented by Silverlands Gallery, and she's, exhibited around the world as a multimedia artist. Carlos invited her to talk to his class, and she was like, I had barely done anything. She just told me this story like yesterday. She's like, yeah, he wanted me to lecture to his Worlds in Collision class. I had barely done anything. Yeah, I was, writing, and not in museums either. She was like, she had a crew that was local, in Oakland that she was running with. And he invited her, and she's Hapa Filipino, to talk to his class. And she's like, I don't know what he saw. This is Carlos, right? I told this story at the opening of the Asian Art Museum exhibition that he would bump up my title to anyone he'd introduce me to. So he'd say, like, this is Trisha Lagaso. She's the director of Southern Exposure. And I'd have to nudge him and say, Carlos, I'm not director. I'm just a volunteer curator there. But then in a year's time, I'd become director. This is the way that he worked. He would put this idea out there in the world and elevate emerging artists and curators and makers. And you kind of felt in a way like beholden to his imagination of who you were, and wanting to kind of live up to his kind of like watermark, for you.
The other phrase of his that I just love, and I think is so profound actually, is this street scholar, this idea of there is wisdom to be found outside of the canon, outside of the mainstream institutions. And why not invite somebody who maybe feels that she hasn't made a big mark in the world yet to come and talk to your class?
I think a lot of artists at the time in the 90s, when we were working together on Worlds in Collision and the website, that we were really drawn to this idea of street scholarship. It was so democratic. I felt like, as this little art scrub, I wasn't welcomed in the Ivy League hallowed spaces of academia. Those were white spaces. None of the ways in which I lived in my own body, I was not represented in those spaces, and wasn't welcome to write either anything new for these spaces. Now I think that things have shifted a little bit, but I really do feel like he invited artists into a space of creating knowledge for ourselves, for each other, for our communities, and then again for these like discrete formal institutions. Like, because he was a teacher, he saw the power of other instructors and educators bringing in these other voices, these other stories into the classroom.
Mark, your mention of Leo Valador, I think that is a really important person to talk about. I'm just curious about the impact of his family in general, but maybe especially Leo, on the kind of artist, the kind of public intellectual that he became. Do you see a relationship there?
I knew Leo, of course. Carlos was a great extrovert, and Leo was more of an introvert. Leo was also extremely independent. He was only less than a year older, but he had gone to school at the Art Institute, California School of Fine Arts, right from high school, and invited Carlos to the party where Wally Hedrick was so warm to Carlos that Carlos later said, I want to go to school there because people treat me like a human being in a way that I've never been treated like in my entire life. And Carlos later wrote a beautiful tribute to Wally. At that time, Leo's work was really kind of assemblage beat and this sort of expressionistic, and later became, very reductive in New York. He was a very early hard edge painter, so a super innovative artist. He was also very involved with music, but his art making was more solitary. And I think in terms of Carlos's own modeling of a different kind of artist, we can look to people like Ruth Asawa. Ruth had a really deep connection to education, to working in the community. I relate Carlos's practice, especially, this when he returned to San Francisco, to Betty Saar, because Betty Saar also in 1969 got access to ethnographic collections, same year as Carlos. It transformed her practice. And Ana Mendieta, after Carlos showed his feathered work at the Whitney Museum in 1972, Ana Mendieta starts working with feathers also. So, there's a cluster of artists who are either working in community or working with non-Western sources that I think are really of his milieu, but it is Leo's innovation and real commitment to originality in art making that was the central kind of spark that ignited his artistic journey.
The sense I have is that Leo also was the first to sort of completely commit and pursue the identity as being an artist. Is that accurate?
Absolutely correct. And Carlos said, even when they were kids, he was so inspired by Leo's drawing ability. Leo was not exactly orphaned, but he lost his mother early, and then his father moved away. And so he became kind of part of, and intimately part of Carlos's family. And so they sort of grew up together, but Carlos called him like an older brother and really watched and was, heavily impacted, and always credited his own inspiration. And I think that was for two reasons. One is to get his love for Leo, but also to, name that his inspiration came from another Filipino American.
Trisha and Mark, thank you so much. You were extremely generous with your knowledge and your insights and your time. I want to thank you again for the show and for the book and the enormous contribution. I know it's many, many, many people who had their hands and put their love and time into those projects. Thank you. That's it for Quiet Before on this occasion. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And
Thanks so much, Melissa. Thanks, Nancy.